This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
Hi, I'm Dean Gation, and this is the Powerful Connections podcast. My guest today is Marc Rose. Marc, just so you know, you're the first guest of Powerful Connections. Marc is a vice president at Morrison Hershfield in Markham, more specifically, the business development lead of the environmental business unit. He has good experience with environmental assessments, permitting, and developing infrastructure such as roads, transmission lines, and power projects. And I'm going to ask Marc to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Thanks, Dean. And I'm excited to be the first interviewee on your podcast. I've been in the environmental industry since 1999. For most of that time, I worked in the power sector, initially on nuclear and gas-fired generation projects, later on renewables, transmission, and most recently, energy storage. That work has been primarily in Ontario, but I have worked in other jurisdictions across the country. And most of the technical work that I do is related to environmental assessments and environmental permitting, which is a critical step to getting projects built. I also spent the early part of my career focused on public consultation and social impact assessment, which are both key elements of environmental assessment. So that's a little bit about me.
We're going to get into some of that. Tell me a little bit about your current firm, Morrison Hershfield.
Yeah, so I joined Morrison Hershfield about 2 years ago. It's a Canadian-based consulting engineering firm. There's approximately 1,200 people. We've got offices across Canada and the US. We provide a range of engineering disciplines, including civil, electrical, structural, and mechanical. We also have an environmental business unit, and that's the unit that I'm part of. And we offer many of the services required to support the development of infrastructure projects, including power projects. And that's things like ecology, hydrogeology, contaminated sites, environmental planning, and public consultation.
That's a list. I want to get right into it. I've worked on many projects, and the environmental review, planning, and permitting are a serious undertaking and can consume a huge amount of time and money. Without impact assessments and approvals, a project does not begin. So I want to review the items of time, efforts, guides to plan and organize environmental activities for transmission lines, substations, and power projects. Today, we're probably going to stay a little bit focused on transmission with the current activity going on. But I would like to see, what do you feel at a high level are items that projects can stumble or get caught on or lose time on or affect their schedule? And there's a lot of things to go through, but give us a high level thoughts on these things.
Yeah, it's a great question, Dean. In my mind, there's two big things that can cause projects to stumble. And the first one I'd call the social license to operate. So there's always an engineering solution to a problem. You can always design a project in a way that's technically sound, and that will likely satisfy the regulators. But where projects tend to fail is where the project proponent has failed to engage the public, other stakeholders, and Indigenous communities in a meaningful way. And that's likely to cause a project to fail or to be drawn out. A great example would be the challenges we have in building new pipelines in Canada. They keep getting hung up on these issues of engagement. Some other organizations have taken a different approach to getting social license to operate. A great example is the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. They've spent over a decade on a siting process for high-level nuclear waste, a really contentious topic, trying to find a willing host community. And that's how they're trying to gain that social license to operate. So in my mind, that meaningful public and Indigenous engagement is key to getting social license, and it's key to avoiding those stumbles or pitfalls on a project. So that would be the first thing. I think the other piece is making sure that you are, as a project proponent, very clear on what the regulators' expectations are. We make the assumption that the agencies and the regulators we're dealing with always follow a prescribed set of policies or guidelines or requirements, and that everybody in that agency has the same understanding of what those guidelines or requirements mean. Yet we oftentimes find that the guidance that they are providing is inconsistent. So one person might think they may have one interpretation of the guidance and another person may have another interpretation. So what we always tell our clients to do is engage early, and this is a kind of common theme, but engage early with the regulators and the agencies, confirm what their interpretation of the guidance or the requirements are, document that early on, and make sure that everybody's in agreement with what you've documented. And then continue to check in with the regulators as the project progresses, particularly when you're facing some sticky issues. So those two things are really kind of critical in my mind to ensuring that you have as smooth a process and as smooth a project as possible.
You're hitting one of the C words today, and that's clarity. And I'm going to identify those as we go along. And they're very big issues today in any discussions with any public proponent, with any Indigenous community, with any of the places we're going to. Clarity is one of the words that we use quite a bit. What do you feel is meaningful engagement? And let's talk about both, public, Indigenous, agency. Let's get to all of them, but talk to me a little bit about that.
So in my mind, meaningful engagement, it doesn't differ too much between public and Indigenous. The principles behind what makes engagement meaningful tend to be the same thing. So the first thing would be starting that engagement process early. This definitely means before any decisions are made. In the past, probably 30, 40 years ago, projects were built or they were developed and the proponent would tell you what was happening. And you really didn't even have any opportunity to influence the project or provide any feedback. So we really need to take a different approach. And for the most part, we have taken a different approach and really started engaging people early. It also means being really upfront and transparent about what, as a proponent, you are planning to do. So clearly identifying what the project is and what the process is to develop the project. Another key element of meaningful engagement is listening. So what are the issues and concerns that affected individuals and organizations have? And not only listening, but demonstrating you've heard those issues and concerns and that you're willing to work with them to address those issues and concerns. And this could include modifications to a project. It could include changing construction methods that you're proposing. Could even include things related to operations. One example that I've dealt with in the past relates to visual impacts associated with a transmission line project. And this could be a substation. And is there a way that as a proponent, you can minimize those impacts? Is there a way to provide screening around the substation so it's less noticeable to neighbors? So really understanding what the issues and concerns are and actively trying to address them. I think the other element of meaningful engagement that's really powerful is it opens the door to collaborating with affected stakeholders about benefits. We often think about projects as only having impacts, but sometimes they can offer benefits. So one example could be, is there a long-term use to an access road that you're building for a project that could create new opportunities for members of the community? Perhaps it's hunters, maybe it's snowmobilers. But again, understanding what the issues and concerns are and what the opportunities are, and really trying to develop your project in a way that maximizes those benefits and minimizes those impacts.
I laugh. I think even the benefactors are even the animals. I know that on some of our transmission lines, the people will see the moose and bears and fox and deer tramping up and down the edge of the right of way because there's no restrictions. It's just easier to get around. And I know the firefighting people always like the width of the right of way because it assists with a fire break. So lots of times if a fire area is more severe than others, you might make the right of way wider just for the benefit of firefighting and keeping it from the transmission line if it's that critical in infrastructure. So all of those things are important. The principles are often something that people forget to identify before they start. How are we going to do this? So I really like that point. Next item that I wanted to talk about was everybody thinks environmental activity is only done between spring and fall when you can get in the field. What can organizations do in the late fall, winter, and early spring to help keep the environmental activities on a project moving forward? And I know there's a lot of things that go on that people don't understand. So a little bit of help in identifying some of those things that are happening outside of good weather.
Yeah, that's a great point. Spring to fall is typically when the bulk of the field work is completed, and that includes natural heritage field work, so the bugs and bunnies type of work, as well as the cultural heritage field work. Once that work is done, and they're typically out in the field doing data collection, our teams will turn their attention to the documentation process. So we've got to take all that information in. We're creating maps, we're creating reports to summarize what we've seen. And then the other big piece of the puzzle there is we have to take that information and assess the effects of the project on those conditions that we've observed in the field. All that work is office-based. It can happen in the winter. That's usually a good time for it to happen. Winter is also a great time to engage the public and other stakeholders, like we were talking about in terms of the discussion on meaningful engagement. We can get input and feedback on the data we've collected, on the studies that we're using, the assessment methods, on what's being proposed. So there's a lot of consultation activities that can happen in the winter, and that also, in some cases, lines up well with when members of the public and other stakeholders may have more time. I think about an agricultural community where you're proposing a project. Winter's a great time to engage those folks because they're probably less busy than they would be at other times of year. I would point out, though, that there is certain field work that is done in the colder months. If you think about some of the bigger mammals, deer, caribou, moose, a lot of field work can be done in the winter. There's certain bird species, winter raptors, that you would do in the winter. Owl field work could also be done in the winter. And it's also important to note that climate change has extended the field season. So we've seen over the past decade or so kind of a creeping in terms of how early we can start in the spring, and then the fall field work has been pushed. Not through the entire winter, obviously, but probably a couple weeks on either end, up to a month. So in some cases, that's given us more flexibility. In other cases, it's made us realize we need to get out sooner than we anticipated, which can cause some challenges as well. There's one other thing I want to mention, which is that sometimes you can do field work that typically wouldn't be done in the winter, but you can create the conditions to get that done when the situation necessitates that. I was working on a renewables project about a decade ago in southwestern Ontario, and the archaeological component was on the critical path. It really needed to get done. We couldn't wait for the spring. And so the archaeologists worked with the regulators to get approval to do work through the winter. And what they did is they set up tents around the work area. They had heaters to keep the ground warm, and they were able to complete that field work in a time when normally it wouldn't be happening. So there are ways with certain components of the field work or certain types of field work where you can do work in the winter season.
Innovation and, new outlooks to things. And that's where you get people putting their heads together to come up with, we need to get this done. How do we solve this little minor problem? And, can we just get a 20 by 20 tent and some heaters and let's keep going and keep the ground warm and so forth. And we'll have some of those fun issues today because I know the people in Sault Ste. Marie are dealing with 6 inches of snow this morning. So the next item that I'd really like to get through, and there's so much to maneuver through, and I certainly appreciate your clear, concise explanation on stuff, but what do we tell people to do to get through all of this and work through these environmental items on a project? I know that on many projects that I've been on, they've been involved with many people, and there's been Indigenous communities involved. There are so many items that come up in consultation and routing, access, timber management, ecological studies, all the items of heritage, archaeology, designated protected areas, wetlands, water resources, birds, migratory birds, species at risk, migratory animals. We talked about the caribou earlier, fish habitat, bats, snakes, turtles, all the other reptiles. There's so many different things to consider. And, over time, we would do a lot of identification of what was natural to the area we're in. Working at Parry Sound versus working at Pikangikum, whole different set of rules and regulations and a whole different set of animals, birds, and reptiles that you're going to interact. So give us a little bit about, all the things that we have to maneuver through.
And it certainly sounds like an overwhelming list when you read it out like that. And it can be scary for proponents. So to start, proponents need to understand the overall regulatory framework that applies to their project and how that fits with their overall project schedule. And we find that clients that are entering a new geography, so perhaps a client coming from the United States to Canada, or maybe they have a new technology, they're quite unclear on what they need to do. One of the things that we'll do for clients in those circumstances, and sometimes for clients that just want a clear understanding of all the various pieces, is to prepare a roadmap that outlines the regulatory framework, and it outlines the various requirements that their project could face as they go through the development cycle or the development process. At a big picture, most projects really have to go through two overarching processes. There's the environmental approvals process, which we typically refer to as an environmental assessment. And then following that, you have environmental permitting. The approvals process really takes a big picture view of the project. It seeks to understand effects on the environment and how those impacts can be mitigated. And it addresses, I'd say, all of the various elements you described at the beginning of the question. The approvals process often also looks at and considers and evaluates alternatives. So for a transmission line project, this could include different routes or alignments for a transmission line. It could consider different substation locations, and it seeks to answer questions like, what are we building? Why are we building it? And where will it be located? And then obviously, what are the impacts associated with that, and how can we mitigate those impacts? Once the approvals process is complete, proponents then need to look at the permitting side, which tends to be more specific. So now we're kind of drilling into the details of a project. We may be impacting a species at risk, and so we need a specific permit related to species at risk that, again, identifies the impact of that species, identifies mitigation measures, and determines what the overall impact is. So we kind of go from this high-level approvals process down to the specific permits that are required later on. And that permitting process usually aligns with detailed design. One important thing to note, and this kind of goes back to where I started in terms of clients entering a new geography or having a new technology, is that the approval and permitting requirements differ between provinces. They also differ by the type or the size of the project. So thinking about transmission projects, for example, in Ontario, where you have a more straightforward type of project, it will follow what's called a class environmental assessment process. This is a predefined process. It's proponent driven. There's no formal approval required. The process identifies the major tasks to be completed, but there's still considerable flexibility in terms of what studies actually get done. So the Class EA defines the aspects of the environment that need to be studied, but doesn't tell you exactly what you need to do. Larger and more complex projects, so for example, transmission lines over a certain voltage or a certain length, follow what's called an individual environmental assessment process. This requires ministry approval. This requires the proponent to define the studies that they're going to undertake, get approval on that process, and then conduct the studies and get approval a second time on the actual assessment. If you think about renewable projects, they follow a different process. That process, the renewable energy approvals process in Ontario, is very prescriptive. It tells you exactly what you need to study, and so there's no real flexibility there, but it's also very clear to proponents in terms of what they need to do. So the process really does differ depending on the type of project you're undertaking.
I think the big thing is the guidelines that exist, and people will be concerned about, there's so many regulations and there's so much red tape to go through. And it's simplified by having these guidelines, by having a prescriptive method, by having the requirements so that you can respond to it and you're not wasting time responding to willy-nilly requests that any agency might have. The agencies are very prescriptive and very focused and know their job. And they really help a proponent get through requirements so they can say, we did this. And, the value of the agencies really comes out when permitting starts the process off to get these things going. And, we did a big project up north, and one of the things we got through was understanding the one part we had to do was the transmission line was short. So the impact wasn't that bad. So the requirements weren't that bad. So, you get into what you talked about in these individual assessments of, less than 2 kilometers or under 115 kV. If it's a 44 kV line and it's only a kilometer long, it's not as big a deal. You start talking about 100 kilometers, 230 kV line, that's got a bigger impact. So it's got different rules. So understanding what you're undertaking is really, really critical. So thanks for that. So let's talk about the importance of the Indigenous involvement in environmental planning and ecological activity, because we've always had great success with communicating with the community elders and the members and the council and chiefs to get to know so much about their project location. And I think people have to understand this is their backyard. This is where they are engaged more than anybody else. And there's a lot of things out there that we can really understand, and that's access, where's aggregate, trap lines that are out there, existing trails, where's the high ground, where's the dry ground, where do we stay away from all the issues, and where are the designated protected areas and the sensitive areas so that we do not disturb or touch them, and we do identify them, let everybody know, and it comes out in awareness. So give us a little bit on where you see the things have come a long ways in the involvement of Indigenous communities and the engagement that's gone on. So give us a little highlight of that.
I've seen the pendulum shift over the 25 years I've been in the industry. It's evolved from a place where there was really no involvement of Indigenous communities or Indigenous voices in projects to where we are now, where frequently there's equity stakes in projects, or the proponents are Indigenous communities. And to be successful with developing a project these days, Indigenous communities need to be meaningfully engaged. They want to be treated as a nation, as another level of government. They don't want to be treated as just another stakeholder. And that, like I said, is a real shift from where things were several decades ago. At that point, probably what was cutting edge was consideration of traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge in projects. And that was covering a lot of the things you just mentioned off the top, understanding what's important to Indigenous communities in terms of vegetation and wildlife, in terms of cultural sites, in terms of traditional uses. And that was initially treated separately from the rest of the assessments that would be done. It was a standalone piece of work, and you would assess it separately. More recently, there's been a lot of emphasis on trying to integrate the traditional knowledge with what I would call the Western scientific knowledge into the assessments. We find that a lot of the features, a lot of the things we're talking about are the same. We're maybe looking at it from a slightly different lens, but there's a lot of value to be had in tying the two together. It makes the assessment a lot richer when you combine it rather than treat them as separate and independent. I think the other piece that we're seeing on projects now is a focus on capacity building. So we're seeing project proponents making efforts to engage Indigenous communities in the collection and analysis of data and being an important part of the assessment, in some cases, permitting process as well. And even where they aren't directly responsible for data collection, we find that Indigenous communities are often getting involved in terms of assigning monitors to accompany the field teams to ensure that the work is being done in a way that they see is respectful and being done in a correct manner, thinking about archaeology in a way that important artifacts are protected or that the wildlife that they value are being protected. And last, as I mentioned at the beginning, Indigenous communities now have equity stakes in projects, or they're the proponents of projects. There's two great examples of transmission line projects: the Wataynikaneyap project in northern Ontario, 1,200 kilometers. It's going to connect 17 remote communities to the electrical grid in Ontario. That's a very different conversation now, where the proponent is Indigenous and they are driving the process. And a similar example in Manitoba, it's an earlier stage project, but hopefully we'll get off the ground, the Kivalliq hydrofiber link. Again, a very long transmission line from Manitoba all the way up to Nunavut. It's going to connect remote communities to the grid in Manitoba. Again, same kind of approach, where it's a Indigenous proponent, and they can really define and drive the process. I know Hydro One has offered a 50% equity stake in all the new projects that they're developing. So we're seeing this shift happen across the landscape related to transmission projects and power projects in general. And it just gives communities much greater influence over the types of studies that are completed in a way that reflects their values and what's important to them. One example that I worked on is a wind project in northern Ontario that was on reserve land. Chief and council and the community had a lot of input into thinking about what needed to be assessed, how that assessment would be done, and what the impacts were related to a transmission line and a wind farm. And I really see this as being the future of how projects get done.
You mentioned the Henvey Inlet. That was one of the projects we did the transmission line on, and the involvement in planning every day of how we were going to approach the right-of-way, the access, delivering poles, the helicopter work, just to deal with the foundations and so forth. And we had a huge amount of people involved in day-to-day stuff because, again, very unique. You know, the Mississauga rattler and the yellow spotted turtles and all the different migratory birds we had to deal with, and a lot of the sparrows. You know, those things became normal order. We know what we have to do. We know what to observe for, and we can make those observations to help everybody get the job done so we can continue to go. And it does add time and money to the job, but if you didn't do it, it wouldn't have been completed. And that's the whole thing about the success. Capacity is my second C word that you've hit. And in all the discussions we've had these days with Indigenous communities, and there's so many transmission lines happening right now, whether it's Southwestern Ontario or Northeastern, the issue of Indigenous ownership, Indigenous involvement, economic opportunities, employment opportunities, because these are legacy projects. These are going to leave revenue generation for these communities for decades. And this isn't getting the tertiary payment or shiny truck in the driveway or whatever. These are legacy things. And this is the right thing that's happening right now. So capacity is one of the things that we're going to talk about some more. You know, one of the words you hit was richer. And I really like the sound of that because it gets the communities, the proponents, the public, the service providers, the contractors all involved in a proper process to do it professionally, respective, and get it done. And together they know they'll get it done. So one of the best things that I helped create many years ago was the construction challenges to determine where you can work when, and the places you have to deal with under frozen conditions, or even after these dates of nesting or migration. So we always want to work in a linear fashion. You know, you and I have talked about this many times, that transmission line wants to be built straight as an arrow from A to B, and there aren't any of those out there. It's just not possible. The biggest issue is the connection of the environmental precautions and restrictions to the construction schedule. The environmental organization of a project has the ability to manage construction and maintain an environmentally sensitive mandate. There's no option to do work that impacts environment. You and I know that. That's when projects stop. So with this creation of the construction challenges spreadsheet to deal with the issues, we were able to deal with the controls, the dates the activity could happen, the areas to manage and execute construction in a linear fashion, in linear as we could. So this helped us deal with these issues. So my next point in all of this progression of activity, what are the best items that any project or owner, what can we do for the best positive outcomes on a project?
Yeah, and I like how you frame that discussion in terms of construction challenges to overcome. My view on the construction process is that the earlier you get the construction team involved, the smoother your project is going to go.
That's for sure.
Getting the team involved during the environmental assessment, to me, is critical. We often have folks working on a project on the environmental assessment portion of the project that aren't familiar with construction. They are field biologists, they're archaeologists, they understand their specialty, but they don't understand the bigger picture. And sometimes they're proposing mitigation measures that just aren't realistic. And so having that construction team involved early on means that you can reality test those ideas. You can have those conversations about whether a mitigation measure makes sense, whether it's cost effective, whether it's something that's doable, or whether the construction team is going to have that allergic reaction to it and just say, this isn't doable. We got to consider something else. One example I can think of is we had a wind project in Southwest Ontario where we had a transmission line that had to cross a provincially significant wetland. This is typically a no-go zone. And so we engaged the construction team, and again, this was during the environmental assessment process, to figure out ways to span the wetland. What could we do that they could live with and that was going to satisfy the regulator? And what we ended up determining or concluding is we could go with larger poles than typical and then string the line across the wetland without having construction vehicles entering the wetland. If we didn't have that conversation with construction, it's possible we would have come up with something that wouldn't have been workable from their perspective. So it was really key to have them involved early on. And we're seeing this happen with Hydro One and their new construction procurement process. I know you've been involved with this, Dean, the early contractor involvement process, which is really designed to get contractors at the table early. Hydro One hires contractors to be part of the environmental assessment process and be part of the permitting process so that input is getting built into the environmental assessment and the permitting the whole way through. So they don't come to the end of the job and say, we can't build this. What you came up with isn't feasible. So I'd say that's really the one big thing that a project can do is get their construction teams involved early. I think the other kind of related topic is thinking about the flexibility that a construction team might need when they're building the project. So you could do the approvals for a transmission line that covers the right of way width. So 100 meters, this is exactly what we're going to build. And so we've done the approvals process, we've done the permitting for that right of way. The problem is that, as you know, oftentimes projects don't get built the way you anticipated it. There's something that comes up in the field. Maybe there's a feature you didn't anticipate. There's a engineering constraint. There's all kinds of things that can happen when you're actually doing the construction that you didn't anticipate. And if you plan your environmental assessment and your field work to consider a wider corridor, so let's say 500 meters as opposed to 100 meters, for example, that gives the construction team the flexibility to move things in the fields if it can't go exactly where they thought it could. So there's a little bit more upfront cost, but you're going to save a lot more money than having, your construction vehicle sitting idle while you spend 6 months trying to work around an alternate approvals or get a new permit for a situation you didn't anticipate. So it's often worth the trade-off. I'd say it's almost always worth the trade-off. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is it's important to have the construction team available early on in the process. I think the same is true as having the environmental team available to support construction as it's happening. There's a few key things that an environmental team can do to support construction. The first is preparing mapping products, and you kind of you mentioned this at the beginning. So these could be maps that show where the constraints are, what buffers might be required, like what kind of setbacks are required from features. What are the timing windows around certain work? In other words, when can you avoid impacting certain species? Maybe they're nesting at a certain time. When are the times of year when you can do that? In some cases, times of day when you can do certain work. So an environmental team can prepare those types of maps to really support construction and make it very clear what's required, where are the go zones and where are the no-go zones. An environmental team can provide training for construction staff, and all staff. That can include management as well as the folks in the field, to understand what those environmental considerations are. And understand things like, how do you identify a species at risk? You may see a picture of it, but really, what are you looking for? What do you do if you encounter one? So there's all kinds of things that, all kinds of training elements that an environmental team can provide. And then having on the ground support as well to make sure that environmental requirements are being addressed. It's really important for proponents to make sure that not only do they do the environmental assessment and then do the permitting in a way that gets them the approval they need, but also to make sure that they're following those requirements. There are legal obligations to following those requirements, and you don't want to be caught being out of compliance with those requirements. So your environmental monitoring team can help make sure that what's being done in the field follows those requirements.
All great points. I like the discussion on how we've progressed. We for many, many years got involved with a customer, whether it was a utility customer or a community or even the agencies, to get through some of these things. And it was always time well spent. The auditing that goes on, if you come to a project and tell the people doing the work, here's what you're going to do, in the first week, it's really good. What's it like in the 10th week and the 20th week and the 50th week? And that weekly monitoring on site to just, that checkpoint or the remember that person that's there, and having an environmental person there to help as a resource is tremendous in job planning. And one of the places I really loved it was at Pikangikum. We had a young lady that was involved in our transmission activity, and she got such a rapport with the agencies and the communities that any plans she made, they had no questions because they knew she was thinking about all of it. But she would also sit with the operators and the line people to say, here's how you're going to do it. Here's how we're going to get this tracked vehicle here. Here's as far as your pickups go. I've put flagging and bales of hay out. You come to this area and you only cross here. And it became really good. Everybody wanted to help her because if she didn't get the approval and the okay and put that in writing for us, they were lost. So the worst thing you can do is have an area where you go, oh, don't go here. Well, it's not marked. How am I supposed to know where to go? It's 100 kilometers from here. It's now covered with 3 feet of snow. How do we know to stay away from it? So all of those things are very important. One of the things is you've hit the last of the C words, certainty. This is the biggest thing I see today in the discussions between Hydro One, Indigenous organizations, the agencies, the communities, the public, is the certainty and the risk mitigation that comes with the communications from the Indigenous community. If they're involved in sea opportunity, life gets really simple. And the discussions we've had recently, they're very high level discussions and they get to be commercial, not political. And that's what we're after. I think it's a very good thing. So any good success stories in showing planning and communication with these parties that you want to partake with us before we get to the end of today?
I really liked what you said about, construction and environmental teams working together. I think for a long time, there was a bit of an adversarial relationship where the construction team saw the environmental team as, the big pain in the butt, as their enemy. And it really doesn't have to be that way. And as you pointed out, there's a lot of value when you do have the teams working together. And I think what I talked about in terms of having construction involved from the outset is a good way to strengthen that relationship so that by the time you get to construction, definitely the senior management team is comfortable with the environmental team, and that should flow down to the people on the ground, and they understand, hey, we're all working together. We're all here to support, the client. We all want to get things done.
That's, exactly the points that I wanted to make today. So environmental planning, permitting, and approvals is such a complex and detailed item. Having the right people like yourself and your organization is important and critical to any project's success and its ability to progress. The connections and the relationships are key to their succeeding. In closing, Marc, I want to thank you for joining us today, bringing us such great insight into project planning and development from an environmental point of view. And in my next episode, we're going to discuss strategy with Chris Benedetti from Sussex Strategy Group. This will be interesting. Thanks for listening to this episode of Powerful Connections. Get in touch with me on my website at dgg5advising.com or find me on LinkedIn at Dean G. Gation. See ya in the next episode.